I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
Just hours after signing the bipartisan infrastructure bill into law, President Biden is expected to take a firm tone during a meeting with China's Xi Jinping. The U.S. and Chinese leaders are scheduled to speak virtually tonight, a senior Biden administration official.
Our responsibility as leaders of China and the United States is to ensure that the competition between our countries does not veer into conflict, whether intended or unintended. Just simple, straightforward competition.
This week, President Biden met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in a virtual summit amid heightened tensions between the United States and China. But did the summit achieve any progress in the competition between the world's two biggest economic powers? And where does the U.S. China relationship stand now on trade, Taiwan, development in the global south, and climate? Here to unpack these questions and more with me today is Evan Feigenbaum, the Vice President of Studies for Asia at the Carnegie Endowment. Here we go. Evan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the summit and the substance of the summit, I'd love if you could just set a baseline for U.S. China relations. Where are we?
Yeah, to be honest, I've been involved with U.S. China relations for about 25 years. And I think there's been a wholesale structural change in the nature of the relationship in the last 5 or 6. And the way I sometimes characterize it is this way. When Richard Nixon went to China in February 1972, it marked the modern inception of the U.S. China relationship. And if you think about that period of time, the United States and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam. China was still crawling its way out of the Cultural Revolution. So from the very inception, the two sides had clashing security concepts and obvious differences of political system and ideology. But once they began to develop an economic relationship, and particularly after China came in the World Trade Organization in 2001, they began to exchange goods, capital, people, and technology on a large scale. And so the economic relationship really proceeded on a parallel track from those clashing security concepts and political and ideological differences. So what's happened the last 5 years is that those two things have really collapsed together. And in a lot of ways, people who drove the economic relationship, people in corporate boardrooms or people who traded stuff, they were aware of the security issues and differences and tensions, but they never really impinged on the relationship. They didn't impinge on the trade. They didn't impinge on business models. Those two things now have collapsed together. And so where economic integration was supposed to mitigate security tension and differences, actually security tensions are getting worse. And now, and this is the structural change, they are bleeding back into the economic relationship. So those flows of capital, people, technology, and data that were supposed to integrate the two countries actually in a lot of ways have become disruptive rather than integrative because they're being refracted back through the prism of national security. So why, for example, do people in Washington no longer welcome Chinese investments in growth companies in Silicon Valley or technology co-innovation and collaboration? It's because in the past, those things were seen as public benefits and commercial public goods or commercial goods. Now they're seen largely as enabling the rise of a strategic competitor.
So I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump supercharged this shift in relationship, with the trade war and just his rhetoric on China. Biden's come in, obviously he's tried to take the temperature down on domestic politics here in the United States. Has he fundamentally shifted the U.S. position on the U.S.-China relationship, or is it just more of the same?
No, he hasn't. I mean, frankly, there's more continuity than change from Trump to Biden. And the first reason for that has to do with what I just described to you. There's this wholesale structural change in which the relationship is much more competitive, but it's also more securitized. What I sometimes say about the Trump team is that they were long on attitude and short on strategy. So American policy toward China was more of an attitude. It wasn't very systematic. So the Biden team came in, and I think they share the same basic zeitgeist, which is a more competitive approach to China, but they are institutionalizers and they are multilateralists. And so for that reason, what they've done is they've leveraged a lot of the same administrative and regulatory tools that the Trump team to give them credit, pioneered, if you wanted, a more confrontational posture, but they're using them in a more systematic and, I would say, more strategic way. And then the other piece is that the Biden team is much more multilateral by instinct, which means they'd like to pressure China and sometimes coerce China, to be blunt about it, in partnership with other countries. And so they've reached out to a lot of allies and partners across the Atlantic in Europe, but also across the Pacific in Japan and South Korea and elsewhere in Asia, to try to build a coordinated approach. Now, the problem they've had there is that, to use a medical metaphor, many of these countries share the American diagnosis of the problem, but not necessarily the prescription. And so there is a coalition in place of the aggrieved. In other words, people who have a beef with China, particularly on the economic stuff and on some of the barriers that face foreign companies in China. But they don't necessarily share the highly confrontational American approach that's been pioneered over the last few years. So I think in an ideal world, the Biden team would like to be more confrontational, but also more multilateral. And my view for a while has been that they can have their cake, but they're not going to be able to eat it. And so essentially they can be more confrontational, but they'll have to be more unilateral, or they can be less confrontational and therefore more multilateral. And so that's the challenge they've had. But I think the basic Biden approach is highly competitive. In some areas, as with the Trump team, rather confrontational, but they'd like to do it by shaping the environment around China.
So, Evan, you've been in government before. You've helped prepare for big summits between leaders. And one key thing I think that's important to understand is what's on the plate of the leader you're meeting with. Obviously, Biden's very focused on domestic issues, Build Back Better, the infrastructure bill, all that stuff. What are the kind of top 2 or 3 or 4 things that are on President Xi's plate?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. To be candid, both leaders in some ways went into the meeting dripping with confidence. There's a lot of talk about the president slipping poll numbers on the American side, but the reality is he had just passed this big infrastructure bill. And I think the administration can look back on its first 11 months and, at least on China policy, feel with some merit that they have done a fairly good job of lining up allies and partners to be, as I said earlier, a little bit more confrontational with China. And so in that sense, the American side went in with some confidence. On the Chinese side, Xi Jinping just came off the 6th plenum of the Communist Party in this party Congress cycle, had a big history resolution that elevated his interpretation of Chinese communist history, but also his own role, and has basically paved the way for him to continue to dominate Chinese politics like the Colossus of Rhodes, and essentially to prepare the way for yet another term in office. So at that level, both sides went in being confident. And when you're confident, you can make interesting moves in a summit, but it also can lead you to want to be more confrontational. I mean, to be honest, if you're the leader of China and you wake up in the morning, the first 6 things you think about have nothing to do with the United States. They're all domestic. Number 1, how to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. Number 2, how to create 10 to 11 million new jobs a year to keep the labor market growing, but also to keep people satisfied. Number 3, how to grow the economy at a requisite percentage that sustains that kind of labor market, slower but higher quality growth, which brings us to number 4, finding a new and more sustainable set of growth drivers over the long term for the economy. Number 5, dealing with a demographic time bomb where the country's really getting old before it gets rich. And number 6, dealing with an economic model that is energy intensive, but energy inefficient. And what's more is extremely environmentally unfriendly. And you don't have to be someone who's a big environmentalist to take a look around China and see that the model hasn't been particularly environmentally friendly. And so, when Xi Jinping gets out of bed in the morning, whether he gets out of bed on the left side or the right side, those are the things that are really on his plate. And I think a lot of these are questions that have bedeviled the Chinese Communist Party for some time.
You mentioned the 6th plenum and President Xi's extended term and potentially term into the future. Is his continued leadership kind of a sign of stability and a sort of a thing that the U.S. can rely on? I mean, is he going to continue his general plan for China, which appears to be focused on anti-corruption and all the shifts that you mentioned into the future?
Well, his general plan for China is really to shift from a long-time emphasis on growth for growth's sake to really a much greater emphasis on what I would call welfare gains and equity. He's focused on a lot of issues like anti-poverty. I mean, whether they've delivered the goods on that is another question, but that's the focus. But also on life chances. And I think that stems a lot from what I sometimes call the eroding social contract in China. If you think about the social contract for a long time, it was basically that the public would stay out of organized politics in exchange for opportunities for material gain. But, we've had decades of reform, and you have 350, 400 million people who've achieved a lot more material things than they had several decades ago. And so for those people, and particularly for urban middle classes, their expectations and demands now transcend things that are merely material. They want food that is safe to eat. They want water they can drink. They want air that they can breathe. They want government that's not corrupt. They want equitable life chances. They want educational opportunity for their children. And I think, as fairly good diagnosticians, the Communist Party leadership under Xi has recognized that set of demands. So that's where his focus is. And part of that focus, if you think like a Chinese communist, is a disciplined, self-regulating one party in a one-party dictatorship that is able to basically preside over those changes. So is that stabilizing or destabilizing? I mean, to some people, it creates political predictability. But to many people, it's fundamentally unstable in the sense that the Chinese government is moving away from models that emphasize market rather than state, that emphasize decentralization rather than centralization, that emphasized entrepreneurship rather than state-centric, state-led businesses, that I think many people argued for decades would be a more stabilizing and sustainable approach to China's growth. So at the political level, it will create the veneer of stability because he will continue in office and he will have a group of people around him that he has groomed and that he's comfortable with. On the other hand, whether they're making the right decisions over the long term for the Chinese economy, for Chinese society, that's something that a lot of people, including here in the United States, criticize the pathway that they're on.
Well, let's turn to the summit now. It seems to me one of the big headlines was that President Xi referred to President Biden as his old friend, and much was made of their previous relationship when Biden was VP. And beyond that, there doesn't seem to be too much substantive that came out of the summit. So, I mean, can we call this one a dud?
No, I don't think it was a dud, but I think you can't judge it by the standards of previous high-level leaders' meetings. In the past, there was always this hunt for deliverables, trying to issue giant multi-page communiques with agreements on people-to-people this and economic interchange that and dialogue mechanism X, Y, and Z. That's not really the way the American side in particular framed the meeting. So one success was, I think, it basically put a floor under the free fall. And if you worry that a highly competitive relationship is heading for a period of full-blown confrontation, that, from my standpoint, is stabilizing and therefore a good thing. Did it resolve anything? No, because as I said before, a lot of the issues between the United States and China are structural and therefore are likely to remain competitive for as far as the eye can see. But putting some boundaries around that is a good thing. And I think both sides, in a sense, got what they wanted out of the meeting. For the Chinese, they wanted one thing, which is that they were very focused on hearing the president mutter various mantras around Taiwan, that the United States has a one China policy, and so on and so forth. And on the American side, it was really to, I think, showcase to the Chinese that we couldn't just hit the switch and flip back to the kind of relationship where he had in the past, where the two leaders would get together, broker agreements, there'd be 6 pages of deliverables, and everything would go back to normal. The American view, and I think it's a bipartisan one, is that this is just a much more competitive relationship. That's a shift, and there's no hitting the reverse switch. So I think in that sense, the meeting was productive, and it sets the stage for the two sides to develop the relationship a little bit more.
When we come back, I'll ask Evan about the big issues that still loom over the U.S. China relationship and whether there are only opportunities for confrontation or there's some opportunity for cooperation. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
How our bilateral relationship evolves seems to me to will have a profound impact not only on our countries, but quite frankly, the rest of the world.
So you mentioned that there's opportunities for collaboration or even just complementary policies. President Biden's rolled out the Build Back Better World campaign. He has worked with Congress on getting the Development Finance Corporation a big market cap so they can do a bunch of investments. It's all done in a way that feels very confrontational towards the Belt and Road Initiative. But isn't this an area where the U.S. and Chinese interests in developing the global South intersect?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say about that is that we ought to put the interests of the countries in the global South at the center of the conversation. They are not proxies in America's strategic competition with China because in their worldview, they're focused on the things that matter to their publics. And what are those things? Growth, development, employment, innovation, opportunity, and integration with the global economy in a way that promotes sustainable development. So if you put them at the center and you treat them as subjects, not objects, it makes it much harder to sustain the argument as an American official or an American company that they should boot China out of their economy, not take any Chinese financing, because that's not a practical proposition for them. China economically is deeply embedded in a lot of countries around the world in ways that are a lot bigger than just infrastructure. So when the United States talks about competing with China through Build Back Better and DFC lending that's just focused on big infrastructure. Number one, it's not very competitive because it doesn't appreciate the scope, depth, and intensity of Chinese connections. But number two, it doesn't necessarily meet the ground level, local developmental and employment needs that people in a lot of these countries have. So I think the United States really needs to, number one, compete with China by focusing on uniquely American strengths.
What are some of those uniquely American strengths you mentioned?
Or to put that another way, to stop trying to out-China China and instead to do things the United States does well. What are those things? Connections to the global capital markets, best-in-class financial services firms, best-in-class science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education, building innovation ecosystems, promoting entrepreneurship, promoting not necessarily hard connectivity, as in the kinds of roads, bridges, and port projects that China does, but the soft connectivity, customs and border barriers, anti-corruption disciplines. These things raise transaction costs, and frankly, they create a lot of inefficiency in these economies. And if you think about that, it creates the potential actually for much greater complementarity between the hard infrastructure China is building and the soft infrastructure that makes an economy tick that the United States can excel at. And I'll give you an illustration of that from Central Asia, which is a region that I used to work on as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. China's built a lot of infrastructure in that region, railways, roads, power lines, things like this. But, you know, in surveys that have been done of business people in some of those countries, the things they complain about the most are not the potholes in the roads, but the corruption at the borders or the backups that lead to 13, 14, 15 hours of truck pileups at borders. And so you can build a road, but merely having a road doesn't necessarily make an economy function efficiently. What you want is an economy that is clean, efficient, operates on market principles. And so there's no reason the United States and China, as I said, can't have complementary, even if they don't necessarily have joint approaches. And that happens best when you put the countries themselves at the center of your worldview. You think about what they need, and then you work with them to help raise the standards that will ultimately influence their ability to and the way in which they bargain with China for the things that they will inevitably continue to do with China too. So I think both as part of the U.S. China conversation, but as part of the U.S. conversation with third countries, especially in the global South, that's what's missing from the American debate, which is trying to fight Chinese apples with American apples when in fact the United States would be better promoting the oranges, pears, and plums that really reflect what's best about the American system.
So the premier issue where cooperation is always talked about is obviously climate. And I wonder if we can just say a word about that. Obviously, Kerry and his counterpart in China announced some elements of cooperation at COP26 just recently. You know, is this really a fruitful area of cooperation between these two countries on such an important issue for the future of the human race?
Well, I think China sees the whole climate agenda, but particularly the technology build-out side of it for mitigation of climate impacts as a potential competitive play for them. So for China, I've never seen it really as an environmental play. It's what I would call a technology play. Chinese leaders in the past have said that China came late to the Industrial Revolution, and then it came late to the Information Revolution. And one Chinese leader famously said, therefore, that he would be damned if China was going to be late to the Energy Revolution. So they want, in many ways, to dominate the technology side of this. And China has also been front and center in promoting green finance. These are things like green credit products, green bonds, green insurance. In fact, when China was the president of the G20, they made green finance a big theme of their G20 presidency. So that's important because there's been so much focus on Glasgow and COP26 and on global intergovernmental negotiations. The U.S. and China put out a bilateral joint statement that had some good pieces to it, for instance, the piece on methane reduction. But I think the way China is looking at this is that they don't need to collaborate with John Kerry to be working with the United States and working globally on climate impacts, because they can work with many of the funds and firms that are extremely eager to commercialize green technology in China, that would like to take Chinese technology solutions and export and scale them around the world, including, as I said earlier, in the Global South. We're about to publish a paper here at Carnegie on China helping Argentina with a renewables build-out. So China sees this as a strength. And so I think that's a long way of saying that both on the technology side and on the finance side, you're going to see a much more active and engaged China. But what that means for the bilateral agenda depends a lot on whether you just treat this as an environmental negotiation at the high level or as something else.
One area of seemingly intractable confrontation is Taiwan. Obviously, since Biden came in, the Chinese military has flown an increasing number of sorties and had a lot of military activity near Taiwan. The United States, it was announced, has soldiers in Taiwan training their military. There's also been some instances where recently I know a bunch of members of Congress tried to travel to Taiwan, and the Chinese embassy got very upset about that. So this seems to be ratcheting up in tension. Can you just describe the current condition of the U.S. China-Taiwan relationship?
Well, I think, to be frank about it, a lot of the assumptions and presumptions that people have had over the last several decades are shifting. And they're shifting on all three sides of that triangle that you just named, in Beijing, in Taipei, and in Washington. In Beijing, the reality is, and let's just be blunt about it, that the balance of power is shifting in China's favor. On the Taiwan side, there's a mix of generational change and the weakening of the Kuomintang party in Taiwan's politics. The United States agreed to have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan, and there has been pressure to inject ever greater levels of officiality into the U.S.-Taiwan interaction. And so in that environment, the status quo is no longer tenable in the way that it was in the past. And so that's the challenge, as all three sides of this triangle are in motion.
What does the U.S. get wrong about the Taiwan issue?
The debate in the United States is too military in nature. Americans tend to think in binaries of war and peace, conflict and non-conflict. So we think of China coercing Taiwan as an event. I think in Beijing, they tend to think about it more as a process. And so some of what you described, assertive flights by the Chinese Air Force, I think that's just something that's probably a new normal that we're going to continue to see more of. But remember, as I said earlier, that there are a lot of tools in that Chinese kit bag. And so if the United States wants to deter China, it needs to be thinking about more than just military deterrence. It needs to be thinking, for example, about how to help Taiwan make its economy and the growth drivers there more robust. And it needs to be thinking about the framework of its relationship with Beijing as well. And that's one reason I think the Chinese clearly went into that meeting with President Biden looking to hear the United States say certain things like we have a one China policy and so on. But I think a lot of the presumptions that prevailed for the last few decades are changing quickly, and it really raises the bar to smart, wise, and well-balanced policy in all three places, but particularly in Washington.
You know, you mentioned the summit. One thing that was notably absent and is possibly an area for both cooperation and confrontation is trade. Obviously, the trade relationship between the United States and China is massive. and a huge driver of domestic politics, certainly in the United States. I would expect in China too, somewhat. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of the condition of the U.S.-China trade relationship? We're still in the kind of post-Trump era. The tariffs haven't been removed. So where's this going?
Yeah, I think honestly the Biden team doesn't know what it wants to do. On the U.S. side, there's no real incentive to move on that tariffs right now in terms of the U.S.-China agenda. And the domestic politics of that are complicated. And on the Chinese side, there's not much incentive to give a lot of concessions to the United States. So where that leaves us is basically frozen in place. There's more conversation going on between the two sides, but it's mostly been the United States exhorting China to meet its purchase agreements and other commitments in the phase one deal that was negotiated by the Trump administration. I think, to be honest, there's a transition in trade policy that's going on generally. That old agenda of dropping barriers, liberalizing economies, that's gone. People are talking mostly about subsidizing their industries. Somebody said to me recently that the trade and industry minister of a very well-known free trading country said, this was a newly appointed minister, that he was more focused on the industry side of his portfolio than the trade side of his portfolio. And if that's true even of a classic free trading country, which this minister was from, that tells you a lot about what the agenda is internationally. Nobody really wants to stop subsidizing their industries. And so in that environment, it's hard to talk about a U.S.-China trade agenda that looks like the one in the past. But I think the challenge the administration has is that other countries are forging ahead in reaching their own agreements with China and with each other. And the United States, rather than looking like the rule maker, now looks like the outsider that is watching the international trade and investment rule system move forward, while the United States has a debate with itself about what it wants to do. The Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, is in Asia today, and she said the United States will not come back into the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not surprised by that. But then she promised a new, even bigger and even better economic framework for the region. That raises the question of why countries that made concessions and committed to the CPTPP would want to do it again. It also raises the question of why, if the United States can't even meet the CPTPP bar, it thinks it's going to do something else. And then China, against this backdrop, has played this game very well. You know, we often hear about how China is inward-looking, insular. Xi Jinping is all about the domestic side, and China's not doing anything externally. Well, there is a country that joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, reached a comprehensive agreement on investment with Europe, upgraded its free trade agreement with New Zealand, applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, and has applied to join the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. And that country is not called the United States. That country is China. So for all the talk, and we can be cynical about China applying to join the CPTPP and the DIPA, is it just trying to backfoot and embarrass the United States? We can be cynical about that. But the reality is it's not China that's been withdrawing from trade agreements. And so even if we're cynical about it, it's a bad look for the United States. I think it's hurt American credibility. And particularly in Asia, nobody expects the United States to sort that out domestically. And so what that means, I think, is that the United States, if I pull the thread out 2, 3, 4 years, will continue to be on the outside looking in, and the world isn't going to wait. And my prediction is China, for all the cynicism about China's motives, is going to be much more central to that process than Americans would like to believe and that Americans hope. And that, in the end, is a very different global setup for the United States than the one to which Americans grew accustomed over the last several decades.
So you mentioned earlier that the United States is, under Biden, re-engaging with allies and with partners to bring its confrontation to China into sort of a multilateral footing. Is the United States forcing its allies and partners around the world to choose between the United States and China?
I think the United States, and particularly the senior policymakers in this administration, often say that we, the United States, are not forcing countries to choose. But the reality is, in accumulation of smaller ways, those choices are being asked for and in some cases compelled. Don't have Huawei kit in your 5G telecommunications backbone. Don't take China's debt finance-based Belt and Road money. Take this package of money instead. In various ways, particularly on the technology side, the United States is asking for choices. if countries are not making those choices, it's not because the United States is not forcing choices. It's because they don't want to choose. So they're the ones with the agency. It's not the other way around. Now, why don't they want to choose? In Asia, they don't want to choose because they can't fight the map and they can't fight economic gravity. They can't fight the map because they got to live there. And China's next door, and China's big, and China's not going anywhere. And to Jake Sullivan's credit, I think it was Jake Sullivan who said this week in public that China's not going anywhere. And if China's not going anywhere, that shapes the cartographic reality for countries in the region.
Evan, thanks for coming on to explain the contours of this important bilateral relationship.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.